Well, good afternoon, everyone, both to our audience here in London and online. I'm Sara Pantuliano, I'm the Chief Executive at ODI, and have the real pleasure to welcome all of you to our event on putting the Glasgow Climate Pact into action, accounting for vulnerability. I think this discussion comes at a very important time. Pressure is really mounting to reform how multilateral development banks and climate funds operate. We're really trying to make sure that they provide more affordable long-term finance and debt relief to those who need it the most. And it is in this context that we need to rethink how we measure development. I think for too long we've relied on a very crude metric, the GNI per capita metric, which decides where finance should be allocated, where development money should go. But as shocks multiply, the climate crisis deepens, vulnerability as an indicator of the ability to withstand and build back from shocks actually may tell us a lot more about a country's development trajectory. And this is particularly true for small island developing states, or SIDS as they're commonly known. The location of the SIDS, I think it makes them uniquely vulnerable to climate-related shocks. Natural hazards like hurricanes or typhoons can wipe out 200% of an island's GDP overnight. And because of their small size, SIDS have actually limited adaptation options. It's very difficult, to recover for shocks of that size. And so several islands are facing existential threats from sea level rise. And more SIDS face unsustainable levels of debt because the cost of disaster recovery is mounting every day. And despite these vulnerabilities to climate impacts, our recent report at ODI on a fair share of resilience finance has showed very clearly that small island developing states receive less climate resilience funding than any other developing country groups. I'll just give you a few stats. They receive 7 times less finance than least developed countries, 11 times less finance than lower middle income countries, and 5 times less finance than upper middle income countries. I think the figures speak for themselves. In recent years at ODI, we have focused increasingly on challenging these assumptions around development and really helping build resilience in small island developing states through our Resilient and Sustainable Island Initiative, also known as RESI. RESI is really deeply involved in researching and throwing light on this very unique development challenge that affects the small island developing states. And so it's really our pleasure to host this conversation today. This is the first public event on the UN new multidimensional vulnerability index. This new index will be launched in July, and it will be really a critical tool to help donors and banks in particular implement the changes we are discussing. So I hope that this event today will provide an opportunity to discuss the principles of the index and see how it could transform international development and climate finance. I'm really delighted to introduce the moderator for this session. His Excellency Dr. Paul Lutero. He's the permanent representative of Samoa to the United Nations, but he's really well known and deeply respected on development and climate issues for his leadership on the matters we're discussing today, particularly for the small island and developing states. So welcome, Dr. Lutero. I thank you all, and Your Excellency, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. And thank you to ODI for hosting this. This is a very important session, and we have 3 very distinguished panelists to respond to some of the issues that I'm sure most of you want some answers to. But before introducing our panelists, I just want to make a few very brief remarks in the context of our meeting today. SIDS have long advocated for a system that takes account of their inherent vulnerability, that goes beyond the simple notation of their income profile. These calls formally enter the UN system in 1994 as at the first international conference on SIDS. Since then, they have been reiterated in two other international conferences in 2004 and 2014, as well as in the UN resolution and other documents. It is a representation of 3 decades of advocacy by SIDS. So it's not something new. It is not until 2020 that AOSIS was able to finally secure a call for targeted work on the multi-dimensional vulnerability index, as opposed to acknowledgement of the importance of such a body of work. A 12-member high-level panel was constituted in March of last year, and the body of work that you will be introduced to today is a combination of the work of the panel and other experts. The panel is co-chaired by Ms. Erna Solberg, a former Prime Minister of Norway, and Prime Minister Caston Brown of Antigua and Barbuda. It's my distinct honor to chair today's session as we discuss high-level principle of adopting an MVI to transform development and climate finance. I now turn to our first panelist, His Excellency Caston Brown, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda. Before entering politics, PM Brown was a banker and a businessman. Prime Minister Brown's contribution is pre-recorded and will focus primarily on the question of why we need a multi-dimensional vulnerability index.
My fellow co-chair, Ms. Ernest Solberg, chair of AOSIS, and fellow high-level panel member, Ambassador Luteru, distinguished guests on today's discussion panel, ladies and gentlemen. I want to start by first offering my sincere thanks to ODI and other organizers for convening this event on vulnerability, an urgent topic of grave concern to all of us in the developing world. My dear friends, in my time chairing the high-level expert panel on the Multi-Dimensional Vulnerability Index, I have come to realize that defining vulnerability is a difficult and politically fraught process, far less measuring it. However, at the same time, I am convinced now more than ever how absolutely necessary it is that we do so and the urgency which is required. Climate change, incidents of pandemics, and changes in income distribution that technology and globalized competition have produced are generating huge disruptions for the most vulnerable that was never contemplated by an outdated model. In that context, small island developing states like mine tick all the vulnerability boxes. Our countries are remote, completely surrounded by water, and prone to being easily cut off from the rest of the world. We tend to have narrow resource bases, and our limited land space imposes hard limits on how much our population and economies can ever grow in absolute terms, irrespective of how much we try to diversify our economies. You would think these known facts would propel us to the front or near to the front of the line when it comes to equitable access to both climate finance and developmental finance. You would be very wrong. In 2020, of the 39 billion climate finance delivered bilaterally, SIDS accounted for 3%. Of the 3.1 billion delivered by the multilateral climate funds that we fought with blood, sweat, and tears, only 7% went to islands on the front lines, And of the 38 billion mobilized by the multilateral development banks, we received a paltry 2%. I don't know about you, but the message that sends me is that when it comes to the climate crisis, we are already viewed as a lost cause. In the sphere of developmental finance, our process are equally grim. We are still being asked to achieve the SDGs by 2030 with the millstone, that is the GNI per capita criterion, hanging around our necks. Ladies and gentlemen, size matters, volume matters. A small population and highly specialized economy can, in good times, generate misleading GNI per capita stats. So, yes, under these prevailing circumstances, an MVI is absolutely necessary. It is essential. Ladies and gentlemen, I would be the first to admit that the MVI in its first iteration will not be the finished article. I mean, data gaps remain, and missing data simply would not allow for a true and complete picture on the ground vulnerabilities for developing countries, and particularly for SIDS. But our work is more than just building out a product. It is building out a process for the continued refinement of that product. And I can assure you that a clear output of this process will be recommendations to fill these data gaps in the short to medium term across critical indicators that are currently too incomplete to be considered. The MVI is not an end in itself. And in your deliberations today, I urge you not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Do not let perfect be the enemy of the good. The MVI cannot be just another academic exercise to be endlessly picked apart before it has had a chance to be. This index can potentially impact real lives. The MVI, as a diagnostic tool, can be used to justify improved, simplified access for the most vulnerable countries to any existing funds designed to boost resilience across both environmental and socioeconomic metrics, including climate finance, where shortcomings or unequal access currently exists. It can help us to gain the access to the concessional financing that we need to improve our long-term national planning, service debts, by providing debt sustainability and spur the development of insurance and compensation schemes that may be our last hope when the waters rise. I urge you all gathered here today to stand on the right side of history and be an ally to this noble cause. I thank you.
We thank the Honorable Prime Minister for his very passionate and direct comments, and we now move to our next contributor, Ms. Erna Solberg. As I mentioned earlier on, she is the former Prime Minister of Norway, current leader of the opposition, also minister and parliamentarian. But I think she's has a very strong commitment to global solution. And, you know, we would like to hear from you, Ms. Solberg, in terms of how, if you can share with us on the work on the panel and what needs to happen next.
Well, I'll try to answer that. I think my co-chair has made a very good appeal for why there is a need for an MVI, why there's a need to get out of that head of thinking that GNI per capita is the only measurement of development in a world where we have a lot of challenges to the idea that if you just manage well, if you build education, resilience, and others in your society, you will develop, because natural hazards, climate change happens, we have pandemic, we have a lot of things that are affecting us, and it's affecting very differently in the world. We are in a different climate belt. We are in different areas where the aspects, and of course there are different resilience. There are countries that are vulnerable but very rich, so they can handle their vulnerability. There are countries that are not so vulnerable and poor and need development at the same time. So it's not to exclude that, because you need to do both, but it is important to do. And the MVI is trying to look at these structural aspects that leads to that, because you can have bad policies that leads to little development, but you can have also structural problems for your country. For example, how often are you hit by a hurricane, or how often are there a natural disaster? Is your income very dependent on a specific good that will be affected by an economic crisis around the world? Everybody knows that now, that the pandemic was a large challenge to a lot of countries on the medical side, but to a lot of developing countries, it was an economic hit that was very difficult. And the Ukrainian crisis now leads to effects on higher gas prices and higher food prices than what we have seen in a long time, which makes countries more vulnerable in different ways. And our job has been to try to find what are those structural vulnerabilities. When something like this hits, which countries will be hit the most, and who is too often hit by this, so that we need to build both their resilience, but also make sure that even if they have higher income, you can put in, you will need extra supplement, because they, for example, are so small that even if they're higher, the GNI per capita is high. If you're too few, I mean, it's devastating and it's difficult to move forward. But our work is in a way, and there's going to be a discussion on I wouldn't call it technicalities, because this is very important part, but that's the whole idea, is that we have to look for which type of both vulnerabilities are structural, but also which resilient points are structural, to make sure that we have a case for not policy decided lackages in a country that would need extra financing. I think, if I look at it from a donor country side, Norway has had 1% of its GNI in development aid for the last 10 years. We've been on the highest ranking of that, and I think to us it's important that what our money is going through is in fact development, but also to compensate, of course, for some of the climate changes, but to make sure that we are not supporting bad policies in countries. So we're looking for the structural parts. What's systematic? What is it and the whole MVI is built on that, and it's built on a mandate given by the UN. And I sometimes say all UN processes are compromises. The MVI, even though it's called an MVI for SIDS, has not a mandate that says it's only for SIDS. It said it's universal, which means that you can rank or put the same to all countries in the world, that you have to look at the vulnerabilities, that is not only SIDS, but also landlocked countries, for example, vulnerabilities. You have to take that as long as the mandate is universal. And I think it's a strength, to be honest, that it's universal, because I think it's easier for others to accept. My problem has also been seen in this, and we are trying to build on the basis of that. And then we are looking at which resilience parts is structural. And there is, of course, as Prime Minister Brown said, we have not built a perfect model, because we see that there are lackages in what type of data we have. We have lackages in the situation that we're in which indices we can use, because there's not enough data on countries around. And there are some issues that it's not so easy to put in, because there's not transparency. For example, I know that debt is a big issue. We've discussed this earlier today. That is a big issue, but there's not transparency around countries' debts around the world. There's a lot of donors who are not showing their cards, and we need to have another type of system for that, even to start to evaluate how this affects. So we have built, based on these structural things, an MVI, which is up for debate, but I think it's the first step towards something that can develop. And we have also, therefore, put up a system of for every country, there is a dashboard that you can look at, and you can see the big vulnerabilities for the single country that can be used by them, and a custodial body system inside the UN to make sure that we have a development process of this MVI when it's finished, and if it's decided on in the UN. But I think this is a moment of truth for a lot of us. We need to build this MVI, and this is the time where it has to be decided on. It's not going to be perfect, but if it's good enough for a starting point for further development, then I think we have reached the time where we should, in the next year, decide on having an MVI and making use for that in the financing structures of development in the world as an indicator, not a sole indicator. The whole basis of this is that it's used together with the GNI, because all we have been looking for is to find vulnerabilities and resilient indicators that is not linked to GNI, because we've always said this is a supplement to the GNI. So you have some funny distributions on the score, because you have some rich countries that are vulnerable, but it's because their vulnerability is based without looking at their income, because the income will be an aspect which you always have side by, because you can never get I think the financial institutions and donor countries to stop looking at income. They will both look at income and vulnerability through the MBI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erna, for emphasizing the critical importance of the vulnerability and resilience aspect of the MBI. I think it's also critical to focus on the uses, the intended uses of the MBI. So thank you very much for those comments. Our last and third contributor is the president of the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. Leon. And I want to ask you, why do you think we need an MVI? And how could the Caribbean Development Bank benefit from or use the proposed scores and rankings?
Thank you very much. I think maybe I want to start this by making one point, which is that we are all interested in what we can call sustainable, resilient prosperity of all citizens of our countries. And I start there because the point is, if it is sustainable, it means that you need to be able to maintain it. The only way you can maintain it is if you can conquer the one constant there is in the entire universe, which is uncertainty. And that uncertainty means that things change, things happen, things shock you. So you can only maintain prosperity if you have a means of handling those shocks. And the only way you can handle shocks is, in our mind, if you have resilience, meaning when the shock hits you, you have the ability to recover, you have the ability to withstand it, and to be able to now continue along the path you were before, the sustainability criterion. So we believe that development, therefore, has to be a function of resilience. And so you have to turn the entirety of the paradigm of development that we are talking about on its head. Now, why do I say turn it on its head? Because what we've done over the years, the decades, is we've said development is proxied by GDP, by GNI. And so our entire focus has been on growing that GDP, GNI amount. Now, if you're going to grow it, you put a framework in place. And that framework is what policies, what investments you need to undertake to grow. And that is why we have the problem we have now. That measure of GNI is a poor proxy to development. And therefore, if you are structuring your policies on growing GNI, you will not get a good impact on development. And so in the end, it boils down to you need to be able to measure better to be able to target better with your policies. That is the one fundamental principle we start with at the CDB. And so what we have been arguing is you need a different anchor, an anchor that is not to replace GNI, and I'm very glad that we need to make that clear, an anchor that is more inclusive than GNI. And that is what we think of as the internal resilience capacity of a country. So every country in the world has an internal resilience capacity, the ability to absorb and to come out of a particular shock to generate development. Our countries, in particular SIDS, Caribbean SIDS, we have a specific set of circumstances whereby shocks that can hit us, whether they be pure climate or economic or other, have the particular peculiarity that our ability to recover takes extremely long periods of time. And so that has led us to the point that we need to be able to distinguish vulnerabilities as a susceptibility, a pre-event idea, from the types of shocks that you could have, economic, climate, and other, the impact of those when they occur on your ability to sustain yourself, meaning recover and continue to grow, your resilience. And it is only when you package those three things together, you generally have a means of asking, what policies do you need to do to be able to genuinely develop in a larger than GNI sense? And that is why we have embraced so much the idea of the MVI. Because for us, the MVI that captures both vulnerability and resilience become that wider measure that if we could, in principle, utilize it, we have a much structured, better way of continuing to develop our countries in the midst of all of the uncertainty that exists around us. And so the MVI as a first pass, as we've heard from both Prime Minister Brown, is that it is a first measure that is better suited, more equitable, more equal than GNI for purposes of development. Is it perfect? It's not yet perfect. As an index, it can only do one part of the equation. It can allow us to see who is maybe more vulnerable. But now as a policy tool, which parts of that vulnerability will help generate the resilience to help provide the development that we are talking about, that equally needs to be worked on. And we think it can be captured through what we are calling a vulnerability and resilience assessment tool that can be captured, measured through a vulnerability and resilience country profile that is equally part of the work that the high-level panel has looked at and is recommending that we do, such that when you blend those together, you end up with a more perfect measure, a foundation for policy that genuinely can promote development. And so from our viewpoint at the CDB, we see the entire MVI framework, which includes the index +++ as a system that will advance development, not only of the Caribbean, or for that matter, SIDS, but I will argue all developing countries in a way that GNI on its own has not been able to do and will not be able to do unless it is augmented. And that is the basis, Ambassador, as to why we embrace the entirety of the concept, and to be able to say that in very much the same way that it's taken us over 50 years as a community to finesse and to promote something that we all accept now, GDP, GNI, and we keep advancing it. Let us start with, even if it is rudimentary, something that can augment GNI. Now it means we are growing that understanding and continue to work on it, develop it, so that in the next 20, 30 years, it may take shorter, but next 20, 30 years, we will now have a better understanding and a better means of promoting the development of countries. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leon, for that perspective from the Caribbean Development Bank. Thank you also for bringing, or at least raising, the issue of the vulnerability resilience country profile, because I think that's very important in terms of the actual implementation on the ground for member countries. So thank you very much. Because of time constraints, I would like to propose that we go to the next panel, and then I'll come back to you two in terms of additional questions. And let me introduce our first panelist, Dr. Louise Fox. She's also the chair of the subgroup, the technical subgroup of the MVI panel. She's responsible for a lot of the hard work that needs to be done. So I'd like to ask you, Louise, what's new about this MVI? And can you tell us about what is special in its methodology and what it is trying to measure?
Sure. Why not? On the last question, I think you've heard a bit already from colleagues about what is special about the MVI. I think what I would say is it's the first, hopefully internationally accepted quantitative benchmark of this particular dimension. And it's of this particular issue, and it's multidimensional. So we have already indices that measure some kinds of vulnerabilities, economic vulnerabilities or climate vulnerabilities, but the MVI crosses all the dimensions of sustainable development, economic, environmental or natural, and social. So it measures the vulnerabilities and countries' structural resilience. So structural vulnerability and resilience. So that's the first thing that's different about it, is that it's multidimensional. The second thing that's different about it is it's evidence-based. Not all indices are evidence-based, but in the panel, we spent a lot of time sorting through the evidence, sifting through the evidence on what factors actually do increase countries' vulnerability in each dimension. So you have some indices that include factors that we in our literature search discovered are not actually related to vulnerability. Now, this index is at the national level. So it's really about country level vulnerability. There are indices also of household vulnerability, and they contain different set of variables or indicators, because again, they're measuring a different thing. So that's new. It's evidence-based, it's universal, and it's multi-dimensional. What was my second? You gave me three questions. I only answered one. I've now forgotten the second one. Sorry, I'm from San Francisco. I might be still suffering from brain freeze.
The methodology, what's
special about the methodology? Again, that it's evidence-based, but also that, vulnerabilities are not often common. Like, one country is usually not vulnerable in all the different ways in which you can be vulnerable, right? And so we have what are called uncorrelated indicators. So we developed methods to aggregate them. Some of these methods are standard and have been used in other indices, some aren't, to try to aggregate them so that a country gets a final score on vulnerability and on resilience. So we got two pillars: vulnerability, as Gina Cooley said, ex post, and ex ante, and resilience, how you're able to adapt and grow and recover, and that's ex post. So we measure those in the three dimensions, and then we combine them, and we combine them using a technique which allows countries to have different resilience, vulnerability and resilience profiles, and yet in combining them, we don't lose these special characteristics, so we don't end up with kind of a mush of everybody being vulnerable a little bit, so everybody being on average, right? So that's another thing. So we have a methodology that does that. And I have to say the details of the methodology of some of the justification evidence and all of the data are available on the UN panel website. Another point is that people have talked about data. Yeah, we're using only publicly available data that has been vetted by a UN agency, the UN itself or an IFI or whatever. So we're using very reliable and stable data. And so we think that also makes this index special. And what was my third question?
I think you answered.
Good. If I've done it all, I'm going to stop. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Louise. No, I'm aware of your response earlier on, but I think some of our participants, the audience, have not heard you. So I have to sort of ask the question.
No, that's true. That's true. You've been listening to me now for over a year. I'm not actually clear how much familiarity the audience has, but again, I have to say all the documentation is on the website. And there's a space for comments also. So we will hope that all of you that are interested in it will read that documentation and send us your comments.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Emily. Emily, you've done some research recently on international finance flow to SIDS for resilience. What did you find, and why do you think an MVI will be useful for SIDS?
Thank you. Yeah, so our report, A Fair Share of Resilience Finance for SIDS, Closing the Gap Between Vulnerability and Allocation, is based on an analysis of international finance allocations to SIDS. We look at all bi- and multilateral finance flows, concessional, non-concessional, public and private philanthropic finance to the 38 SIDS countries for three things. So we have a particular focus on adaptation finance, finance for renewable energy, which is particularly important for SIDS because of their dependence on energy imports. It's important for their resilience. And thirdly, on finance for disaster risk reduction, noting that SIDS are highly exposed to other hazards, not just those that are being aggravated by climate change. And the report does find that SIDS are receiving considerably less finance for their resilience than other groups of developing countries. Sarah mentioned at the beginning some of those figures. That's for absolute levels of resilience finance. But even as a percentage of GDP, resilience finance for SIDS is low. LDCs, excluding SIDS, receive 5 times more, which is notable. And then if we look at the types of finance, more than a third of this resilience finance going to SIDS is in the form of loans and other debt instruments, of which a third of that is not concessional. So we can already begin to see a kind of picture in some of the structural inequalities in the way that finance is being allocated, international development and climate finance is being allocated. The problem, of course, is that without significant levels of resilience finance to implement programs of work to build the adaptation and resilience, SIDS will continue to be devastated by extreme weather and also perhaps the less dramatic but more insidious effects of sea level rise, salinization, coastal erosion, and so on. And SIDS are, in fact, receiving higher levels of resilience finance per capita, as you may expect, but this is not really a fair comparison. And of course, the reason for that is because of the very small denominator. You divide a number of a level of finance by a very small number, and you're going to get a large sum. And it's in the explanation of why that's not fair that we need to really pay attention. And you've heard already from other panelists some of the reasons why SIDS are disadvantaged, precisely because they are small, they they can experience very crippling impacts and losing very high levels of GDP from impacts of external shocks. That doesn't happen to other countries. And because of the high cost of development as well, particularly in the more remote islands and the lack of economies of scale. I mean, reportedly, it costs 4 times more to implement a development project in a small island developing state than it does anywhere else. So these are all reasons why SIDS will need higher levels of per capita, a higher per capita share of available resilience finance. In the report, we also compare finance in relation to vulnerability, and we use the pilot MVI scores and focus particularly on environmental vulnerability to look at the differences between SIDS and non-SIDS, and find that SIDS have some of the highest levels of environmental vulnerability in relation to resilience finance. There's a relationship there, and conversely, many non-SIDS have low levels of environmental vulnerability and very high levels of resilience finance. So I encourage you to look at the report to look a bit more at the figures there, but we can observe that relationship from the environmental vulnerability scores that were produced during a pilot phase. So the report points to this very wide gap between vulnerability and allocation of finance. I want to just cover 4 recommendations that cut across the development and climate finance reform agendas. So firstly, the donors should aim to mainstream the use of a vulnerability index as a standard complementary measure to GNI per capita. That's already been discussed in the allocation criteria. A few MDBs have already done so, but this needs to be replicated across all public development banks. And allocations need to increase to SIDS consistently, not just in a crisis. The second is around using MVI indicators in the graduation process. The OECD DAC members need to really seriously consider this additional criteria for graduation so that countries don't graduate while they are still at risk from being set back by a shock, and at the very least, there should be put in place additional support over a determined period to boost the resilience of graduating countries. The third recommendation is around climate finance reform, which I'm happy to speak more about. The new collective quantified goal on climate finance is up for renewal in 2025. And our research suggests that sub-goals are really needed, especially for SIDS and other vulnerable countries, because of the faster pace at which they're experiencing the climate emergency and their lower capability. So this would help spur reforms, I think, in the international climate funds to improve access. If you have a target of how much finance needs to be allocated to particular groups of countries, that could possibly begin to spur some reform within those institutions. And finally, this long-term goal could also specify a balance of instruments so that there is a kind of sub-goal on the percentage of finance that needs to be in grant form or very low interest long-term loans for resilience investments. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thanks for sharing the findings, of course, the recommendations that you made. I think some of these are perhaps not completely new in terms of the importance that you place on them. But I think what is important is that we need the evidence. And I think the research finding provides those evidence in terms of the MEI. So thank you very much. I note that we've got 10 minutes left, and what I suggest is that we take 2 questions from here, those who are present, and then perhaps those who are participating, attending virtually. So perhaps we can take, are there any questions from the floor? Yes, sir. You.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting.
You'll get the microphone.
Yeah, get the mic.
No, online.
Yeah, this was very interesting 45 minutes. I have a comment and I have 2 questions actually, and I'll spare the comment. The first is, so you have this, it's a technical comment, which is a question. So you have an index. Now, over time, you would expect, if all things went well and your index actually did result in progress, you would expect the indices of individual countries to converge. So where would that convergence be? So in your index, what is the baseline and what is your optimal convergence level? Or am I completely off track since I haven't seen it? The second technical question I had was a suggestion. So vulnerability happens in poorer geographies as well. And I wouldn't actually fully, I don't think you meant to say it, but it came across like that. GNI levels per capita and vulnerability also endogenous. So poor countries are vulnerable because they're poor, and the SIDS are not necessarily, but poor countries are. So it would be useful to take this index to poor countries at the subnational level. I was wondering if you've already done that and test it out there. That has a political advantage that it brings you into political alliance with larger poor countries. I'm thinking of Bangladesh. And I was wondering if there's any plan to do that. And the final question is, when will you review this? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll have one more question, and then we'll give our panelists another minute. 30 seconds is to respond. I'm very sorry. Please. Yes, please, madam.
Hello, I'm Valentina from Argentina. I work in climate change with local governments. Actually, my question is, I know that this index is at the national level, but right now, for example, we are reporting to the United Nations through CDP platform. So in order to demonstrate that we are not achieving, but aligned with the 1.5 Celsius degrees, we use the IDH index, the one of United Nations, Okay, so is this national index going to imply that at the subnational level, we need to start constructing another index, like for instance, the IDH, because this is not a requirement for us. We do it voluntarily, like we do it just in order to comply. But I don't know if I'm being clear. Are we going to need to start constructing another kind of index at the subnational level so that you can use it for elaborating the MBI?
Thank you very much. So those two questions, we'll start from this side and we'll go across.
Just quickly, so this MVI is a national level index, and it's compiled from internationally available data. Countries don't have to do anything except continue to report the data as they usually do. Now, did we consider it as a subnational index? No. Why? We've had enough trouble putting together an index at the national level and there were many variables that we wanted to use that we couldn't use because there was too much missing data. And so, no, this is the answer is this is not intended to be, if a country wants to calculate this itself and has the data to calculate it itself on for regions, a big country, it could choose to do so, but that's not really our purpose. Now, do we expect the indices of countries to converge? No, we do not. Why? Because this index is by design to measure structural vulnerability. So this is not something that actually changes over time. Things that change over time are driven mostly by policies and programs and investments. And these do not change over time. And so, no, we do not expect the vulnerability of the US and the vulnerability of Jamaica to converge. Jamaica is an island country in the Caribbean, subject to hurricanes, and the US is a big country with a big population, a very diverse economy, and it can spread its risks throughout the big country and the big economy. So no, we do not actually expect convergence. And review, we're in the review process. So please go online and have a look at our materials and give us comments and give us your review.
Thank you, Louise. Emily?
I think Louise has explained it really well, but just to add, I mean, there are elements, the structural elements, such as, I don't know, coastal elevation or something. You wouldn't expect that to change ever really, or, you know, potentially very, very slowly. And I think that's the point of it. It's also makes it quite, yeah, so political and contested, like an index that you can't necessarily sort of act to shift the scores, or not very quickly. And I think that's the area which some of the development partners have reservations. But yeah, certainly the point of it is not that the scores are going to change very quickly.
Thank you.
It's mentioned that the review process is ongoing now. This is nearly a part of the review process, that we have a public meeting, but we also have this custodial body that we've proposed two different, maybe it's not so different, but two different ways. We need a secretariat in either in some of the UN bodies with the responsibility for following this, or a custodial, a secretariat with a expert level on the top, just coexisting with some UN body, so that, because we believe we are in the start of this process, so it can be elaborated and worked more on in the future. So we're trying to also build in that type of mechanisms for the future, because we don't think we will make a perfect suggestion. No.
If I can just add to that, whatever index you do is going to be a snapshot in time. And so because it's a snapshot in time, you would need to measure it at different points to see whether it has or has not changed. So from that perspective, what we want to be able to do, and the panel is looking to recommend that, is that if you end up with a vulnerability and resilience profile, then you have the means of observing that profile over time, and changes in that profile, if you compare them, would now be indicative of whether or not you are, quote unquote, developing, because that in essence is what you're looking to do. You will develop if your resilience, if your reduction in vulnerability now makes it easier for you to develop going forward. And that links equally to the issue of poverty. Poverty is, as it were, a measure of income. We don't yet, although we should, talk about poverty as poor development. And then you would now need to say, how do I want to reduce that gap? Which means you need to have some form of threshold, as you are suggesting, and how far you are from that threshold. And therefore, you would need a suite of policies equally to say, now, what do I need to do to shift me from where I am to the threshold of interest? But there are two very different elements. One is a stock snapshot. The other is now the active policies Louise was talking about that can now generate the development that you're interested in. And that's a different measure of another snapshot at some point in time.
Thank you very much.
I don't think we have any questions online.
Can you read it out, please?
The question is from Raki Islam. And
It's on the microphone.
In the microphone.
Take the microphone, please.
Okay, thank you. So the question is from Raki Islam online. How do we ensure the ODA eligibility of SIDS does not crowd out funding for traditional recipients of ODA?
Thank you. Panel member, anyone?
Well, one thing is that we have to lobby for people to increase their donor participation. There's a whole discussion that comes up to the meeting in Paris in the late June on financing, which is the Bridgetown initiative made in Barbados, which is of course discussing how can we use the funding we already have in a better way and make sure of that. But I also think that we have to address the fact that this is also an issue about fairness. If you are vulnerable because you're a poor country, or you're vulnerable because climate change changes your country, is there a reason why those who are vulnerable because they are poor should only be eligible for international funding? Or should also those who are vulnerable because of climate changes also be eligible for it? I mean, it's also a fairness issue about, if where the problem comes from. So I think we have to be honest that we also have to look sometimes at the vision of the money we have. And if that is the fairness issue, I think we should we are putting up more funding for Green Fund, for a lot of other climate change. And if the countries who are most vulnerable for climate change is not getting money, then of course it is a bit, I mean, it should be disputed in a way that they have that some of that money will be divided, or we would just make totally new arrangement for them. And coming from a donor country, I have to be honest, most countries have a sum that they have decided on, like 1% or 0.7%. The nice countries have done that. The other ones have not done so much. And inside those 0.7 or 1%, there will be a division to what we think policy is the right thing to do. And I think that's where you just make sure that all countries who are vulnerable in some stage are part of this possibility.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think with those comments, it's, we'll run out of time. Let me, on your behalf, thank our panelists for their very measured, interesting, and direct comments. I think the issue of the MVI is very important for all developing countries. I think some points have been made in terms of the need to ensure that it's evidence-based. And I think the work will continue. This is not the end, it's the beginning, and thank you very much. I will now invite Rebecca Fabrizi, the UK envoy, SIDS envoy, to perhaps for some closing remarks.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ambassador Lutero, and thank you again to ODI for organising today's really interesting discussion, and to the panel for all of their amazing work on this MVI. I think this message has been very clear today that what we're looking at is how we can address vulnerability. This for us is very important, as it's part of the Glasgow Climate Pact that we want vulnerability to be a consideration in allocation of finance. And we want to ensure that we're working on supporting resilience and increasing resilience in the SIDS. We know that the small island developing states are have a particular combination of economic and climate vulnerability, with narrow economies and being on the front line of climate change, many of them. And also, of course, some of the SIDS are also poorer developing countries. Some of the LDCs are also SIDS as well. So it's, they're not distinct groups. They overlap. I think around 20% of developing countries are SIDS, 25% even, maybe 20% of the LDC, something like that. There are some quite compelling statistics about vulnerability. UNCTAD found that the SIDS are about 35% more vulnerable on average than their peers at that level of development. And we've seen some worrying trends. So the pandemic has on average affected SIDS worse than other groups, and they've taken a longer time to recover from that, which is partly because of things like tourism dependence with narrow economies, and so on. So that, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that this is a really important issue. There's been a response to the situation of SIDS. So the World Bank has responded with their small island economies exception, and the UN, of course, has looks at SIDS as a group with special development needs. But there's consensus around the fact that there is some vulnerability, but it's difficult. There's a big debate about how you measure that, which is what we've been talking about today. And of course, it is very complicated, but it's very important. So the MVI could be a good solution to this. There's been a really interesting comments and discussion, and I know that the panel has got plenty of food for thought. And of course, it's really important that the MVI that we come up with, we would really like it to be something that can be adopted and used widely, and be a kind of tool that we wonder how we ever managed without it at some point. So, we're looking for a very robust and credible outcome to this whole process. And we would really like to see that by the UN SIDS Summit, which is next year in Antigua, in June, I think, next year. So we're really looking forward to that as being a really important moment where we can celebrate some progress with regard to recognising some of SIDS special issues. So I think, it's important that the panel takes the time and looks at the feedback and make sure that we come up with a product that is really, really good. We've set out a vision for SIDS in the UK's international development strategy, focused on ensuring climate and economic resilience. And we really want to make sure that we make some really concrete progress towards that. So we've done some work, as well as supporting meetings like this one today. We've established a task force, launched a task force in the Development Assistance Committee of OECD to look at developing a partnership ahead of the summit. We also have a global Friends of SIDS group, bringing together a coalition of SIDS and development partners as well to work together to look at how we can secure international reform. And so we're really looking forward to working together with our SIDS friends, donor partners as well, to make sure that we make some real progress before the summit next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Emily, do you wish to make any final?
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming, everyone online. Hopefully this is the beginning of a longer discussion.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. Thank you.